Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Politically Depressed. As always, I'm your host, Ayman McAdam. I'm recording this episode on Thursday, the 31st of October, 4:45 p.m. Central European Time. Again, another apology for this very belated episode. This is, I think, the longest gap in the episodes since I started this podcast. But this time I have a very interesting reason, which will actually be the subject of today's episode, which is that I attended an incredibly nourishing and amazing conference in Marseille, in France, of internationalist activists from so many different places across the world. And it's called The People's Want. And I attended it 2 years ago in Montreuil, Paris, which is like a suburb of Paris. Which, for those that don't know, the suburbs of Paris are very different from Paris and very interesting places themselves. But the conference was equally, if not more so, illuminating and just such a nourishing space and so necessary for me and for everyone who attended in this moment of genocide, of patriarchal backlash, of climate and capitalist collapse. And so I'm going to share some reflections of my week there. I actually stayed in Marseille for about 10 days or 12 days. But I'll talk about the conference. I'll talk about my experience. I'll talk about what it is. And I don't know. I'm going to do a few episodes where I'll be interviewing some people that I met there because it's just really fascinating. And every single person I met there is just an incredibly powerful, brave, dedicated activist in their own context, or revolutionaries in exile. And so there's just so much to talk about, and I do want to share what I've been doing for the last 2 weeks alongside not doing this actively and having a lot to talk about aside from the conference. And so I'm probably going to release a few episodes over the coming weeks at a much sort of faster pace to sort of fill in for all the stuff I didn't talk about. So before I get into anything, hello, welcome to this podcast. I want to remind everybody that this podcast is supported by listeners like you. And if you want to keep this podcast going, if you want to help me grow this podcast and the wider network around it, then please consider heading over to patreon.com/fromtheperiphery. From the Periphery is a media collective that is hosting this podcast, many other podcasts, and other media projects that aims to build internationalist dialogues from below, building internationalism from below. And so becoming a monthly member of our Patreon provides us sort of sustainable support. But you also get access to a lot of really cool stuff, including my sub-series, Keep This Between Us, but also early access, and I don't know. We'd really appreciate it. Of course, there's also the tip jar for one-time donations. I'll leave all these links in the comments below. And if you can't support financially, you can still support this podcast by liking or leaving ratings wherever you're listening to it, writing comments just to boost the algorithm, anything from Free Palestine to those random word soups that people have been writing, which I'm not a massive fan of because I do want people to more engage with the thing. I understand that even if they write this word soup, it doesn't mean they're not engaging, but I feel like too many people are just doing that sort of word soup that's a discussion for another time. So that's the sort of announcements for this episode. Now, before I start talking about The People's Want, the conference that I had attended over the last 2 weeks in Marseille, I've obviously got a few headlines that obviously have accumulated because I haven't talked in the last 2 weeks, and a lot of shit has happened. Too much shit has happened that, has left me obviously distraught constantly, and it's hard to put into words. The Israeli aggression on Lebanon has constantly escalated. They have functionally been ethnically cleansing the south and destroying entire villages. the Israeli army have entered Lebanon, booby-trapped or set up explosives into a bunch of houses, a bunch of mosques, a bunch of areas, a bunch of marketplaces, and just completely decimated and destroyed them. And this is part of the tactic that we've seen in Gaza, which is just to completely destroy an area, to destroy its infrastructure, its buildings, its monuments, and with it, any ability for people to return, ultimately making it uninhabitable, which has already been the case in the south of Lebanon for the last year, with the use of white phosphorus, with bombing and creating forest fires, and destroying the agriculture. The south of Lebanon is a very fertile area, and people's livelihoods depend on the land, and most of the country kind of depends. I mean, a lot of the food we get is imported, but regardless. So, over the last couple of days, there have been a few things I'll mention. One of which related to Lebanon. One is which the Israeli army, the sort of spokesperson of death, created an evacuation order for the entire city of Baalbek. This is a city of tens of thousands of people, and it's an entire city. It's not an evacuation order. None of these are actually evacuation orders, for many reasons, one of which is they give people no time to actually flee, but also any of this bullshit that they're following, legal or humane procedures, it obfuscates the fact of what they're doing, which is indiscriminately bombing civilian infrastructure and terrorizing an entire population, and just wanton destruction of urban areas, which is just so basic, like such basic international law. Like this, I think the Nuremberg trials, you know what I mean? The wanton destruction of cities. Anyway, so that's been fucked, and a lot of people fled almost immediately, and within 4 hours of releasing these evacuation orders, they begin bombing Baalbek with incredibly violent bombardments. The footage is incomprehensible. And I mean, they've been releasing these orders and bombing not just like southern Beirut, parts of central Beirut, but also so many areas in southern Lebanon, including the city of Tyre, which I'm going to stop slowly using the English term for it, because in Arabic it's Sur, which is very different. Tyre sounds really weird, and people need to just start getting to know, even non-Arabic speakers, Sur. Like, get used to the names of these places in Arabic. Yeah. So, Israeli aggression in Lebanon, in southern Lebanon, in the Ba'a, escalating constantly. There's still about, 20-30% of the population of Lebanon is exiled, is internally displaced from their homes, and are seeking shelter in places like Beirut, in the mountains, in the north. And even there, they do not have safe refuge. The Israeli army have been chasing these people. There was an attack about a week or two ago in the north of Lebanon, in Zgharta, in Ehden, that killed an entire family of displaced people from the south. This is a Christian town. This is very far from the south. And it just goes to show this kind of cruelty, but this tactic of sectarianizing this aggression and making people afraid of being around Shia people who are fleeing from the south. And there's this constant target on their backs. This recent evacuation order of the entire city of Baalbek also came with random phone calls that people were receiving. There's one report from someone in Beirut who is from Baalbek, who is a researcher of the city of Baalbek. He got a call on his landline. There's so much penetration of our just entire space by the Israelis. There is this real sense of complete domination, that their eyes and ears are everywhere. Not to say they're invincible. The one sort of thing that's sort of some good news is that many, many Israeli soldiers in the south have been killed. that Hezbollah have been hitting successfully targets and military personnel in the south at a kind of accelerated rate, which is, it's just this kind of thing that they're fucking invading. Anyway, so yeah, all that's been happening. There's been increased talk by Najib Ate, our billionaire prime minister, kind of interim, of a ceasefire that's in the works. There's this guy that I don't know if people know, Amos Hochstein, this fucking American envoy. He's an Israeli. He served in the IDF. This person should not be allowed in the country, let alone meeting with our top officials. But of course, the officials he's meeting are very cozy with the Israelis, i.e., Nabih Berri. And yeah, this ceasefire proposal doesn't have a ceasefire in it. It's the same thing in Gaza. The ceasefire they're proposing would end hostilities, but I don't know what that means, because built into it is the Israeli continued ability and allowance to bomb areas in the south whenever they want, to prevent Hezbollah from rearming itself. What does that mean? Whenever they bomb certain areas, they constantly say this is their arms. And so, or supply routes, which are just our roads. They bombed a few weeks ago the main road connecting Lebanon to Damascus. And so, same with Gaza. When they talk about a ceasefire, there is no ceasefire in it. It's all bullshit. It's all a smokescreen. And the guy himself, Hochstein, is a personified smokescreen, because he's coming as the US envoy. He is literally a former IDF soldier. He is not a a partial third party, whatever, between the Lebanese and the Israelis. He is functionally an Israeli fucking diplomat. I mean, this has been the case for decades, with the US pretending to be a sort of partisan or like and they've shown over the last decades, if it's not obvious to anybody, it is so obvious now. I mean, it was a bit, obfuscated more with like Clinton. But now the amount of funding, the amount of support, the amount of diplomatic cover that the Americans have given the Israelis, how far the Americans have gone to support it in this moment of genocide and continued occupation and continued settler colonialism, as well as how they're not coming and presenting whatever, they're presenting the threats of the Israeli state. Like, this is known. What Hochstein presents to the Lebanese whatever is not, here's a proposal to mediate this so-called conflict, but these are the Israeli demands. And either submit to them or, we will continue bombing you. All these explosives, all these missiles are American made. Lebanon at the moment, as with Gaza, as with the West Bank, is not just facing the Israeli military machine, it is facing the American empire. And that's a terrifying, terrifying thing to be faced with. Anyway, so yeah, I've got some thoughts that I want to share, like shifting gears a little bit to the US election, which is happening in like 5 days or something. I have such little energy to talk about this. I'm so depleted to be entering that space, and I have not read much. I've seen videos, I've seen discussions, I've seen takes, and I don't know. I have a lot of thoughts, but also I'm very aware of how the entire electoral system in the United States, even the so-called third-party candidates, they do not present the actual... They're not places that people should be putting their resources in as much as I see people doing it. It feels so frustrating that people are not just grasping the severity of the moment, that they do talk about it. I mean, I watched a video by someone whose politics I quite respect, and she was talking about she had voted for Jill Stein, and her reasoning was that the Democratic Party has become a fascist party, and it's functionally the same as the Republican Party, which, I mean, the equation I think I disagree with, but ultimately I just found it quite bereft of, removed of any actual analysis, because what it functionally is a replication of the Democratic Party's rhetoric. I mean, Harris is just not Trump. And that's all she can do. And that's all they've been doing. I'm not Trump. You don't want to vote for me? Okay, you're voting for Trump. And there's no substance, because she has no substance, because the Democratic Party is just completely a party of the business class, and which has no analysis. It's just about short-term profit. And yeah, I mean, that's a lot in a nutshell, but I mean, her incredibly fucked up dedication to the Zionist project and to the continuation of this genocide aside for just a second, and just in terms of structurally what these parties are. But so then, what is Jill Stein's messaging? She is not Harris. You see what I mean? Again, I have not had the energy, because everything is so fucked up, and we drastically need not a disruption of that electoral system, and not the election of this or that candidate, because again, coming from where I'm coming from Lebanon, yeah, functionally there is not that big difference between Harris and, I mean, God forbid, Trump. I don't know. The one thing that I'm still kind of, no one is really addressing, is how obvious it is that Netanyahu wants Trump, that Sisi in Egypt wants Trump, that Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi wants Trump, that Putin wants Trump, that, like, all these people who we fucking despise. I mean, Netanyahu, it's just so obvious how much he's gunning for a second Trump presidency. And that doesn't seem to factor in when we think about the difference between Harris and Trump. Because I don't know. Because, again, coming from where I'm coming from, I don't understand how much worse it can get. How much more support the Israelis can get. It's really weird. Like, another example of something similar to this is I've seen there's been coverage or some reports that the BBC have been biased towards Israel. And it's one of these insane articles that you read that you're like, oh yeah, of course, they're super biased, because they're like hardcore dehumanization of Palestinians and constantly just like reciting 100% what the Israelis are saying without any journalistic integrity or scrutiny. But then no, you find that the article is the opposite. It's saying that it's unfair against the Israelis. And it's just, it blows your mind. It just boggles you, because you're like, what? How much more pro-Israeli can it get? You know, the few little tidbits that it's not completely fascist of like, fuck them, they should all die. Instead, doing this kind of objective bullshit passive voice, like, that's a bias against Israel. It's I don't know. But regardless, so this whole thing of presenting oneself in negation of another. So Harris is not Trump and Jill Stein is not Harris. Because again, this video that I'd watched, you know, mostly was talking about the Democratic Party. I voted for Jill Stein because fuck Harris. And fuck Harris, fuck the Democratic Party. They are completely responsible for the ongoing genocide, for the assault on my country at the moment, for the aggression, for the ethnic cleansing of the south of Lebanon. They have no like potential for reform or for any whatever. I completely agree that voting for them kind of condones this, and like we are in like the Americans. Sorry, it's so funny because I'm not American. I have no ability to affect this. And not saying that Americans themselves, because as this person suggests, like popular opinion does not shift American policy, because of oligarchical rule and whatever. But there's this weird thing where I, as someone who is very much so within the American Empire, I was raised in the peripheries of the American Empire. And I mean, technically we all are, but very much so within, that I have that kind of thing of we, or because obviously I'm, going to be impacted. Again, we all are. When we think of the climate collapse, it's the entire fucking human civilization. When you think of the potential of nuclear war, it's all of us. But at the moment, the first and foremost are the people of Gaza and Lebanon. In terms of American power, God, this is so fucking exhausting. But essentially, I don't see that much discussion of Jill Stein herself, of the policies, of the analysis of, okay, we need revolutionary change. Okay, the third party thing could fuck up the kind of two-party whatever. But I kind of see a lot of repeats of like discourses that I thought were left in 2016, which is this kind of accelerationism, which is let's like fuck up the system and then it'll be in chaos, and so then we can organize and fight back. And that didn't fucking happen in 2016. But also because that analysis is kind of not very cogent, because actually the opposite, when you fuck up a system or when the system goes into a bit of a whatever, it's actually much harder to organize. And then what does that organizing even mean? Even this analysis of vote in another like Harris, and it's easier to organize under Harris. And that's something that like theoretically I understand and I agree with. But like then when the people talking about this, they're not actually talking about what does that organizing look like? How do you build power from below in the United States? And again, those are like serious fucking conversations that I'm sure a lot of people are having, but it's just not as, I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't have opened any of this up because I know there's a lot of feelings and sort of like discussions around this, but I'm not seeing the depth of the discussion. Like the real confrontation of the situation and the necessary political actions and organizing and like thoughtful organizing that needs to happen. And I mean, just as a little note, I don't trust Jill Stein at all. I really don't. I have followed her career for like the last 10 years and just like, meh. Like, okay, she says a good thing here or there. In this moment of intense genocide and like Zionist delusion within the American kind of like political business bourgeoisie, whatever ruling class, it's very easy to say something decent. I mean, I'm against genocide. That should, a year ago or 2 years ago, that would have sounded like the most moot statement that like obviously we all are. But now, it's like a radical thing. You can get fired for saying that. But yeah, so like, I don't know, structurally, I have no faith in the electoral system. I think people have spent too much energy thinking about it, and while having even those discussions of, okay, the day after, like people should be talking about that now, of like that organizing, that fighting back, that sort of building power outside of electoralism. Yeah, I have no substantive thoughts. I don't know what I would do as if I were a citizen of the United States. I genuinely don't. I don't, and so again, there's that kind of thing of, I understand not voting for the Democratic Party. I don't fully understand the logic of voting for the third party, because, again, I remember where Jill Stein was in 2016 when she was talking about Bashar al-Assad. Her position may have changed now because it's just easy and it's a bit inconvenient to bring up that stuff. I know she was confronted by Mehdi Hassan, who also I really don't like. I think he's a bit of a narcissist. Sorry, I'm in this phase at the moment where I'm just letting it all out. But regardless, yeah, I don't trust her. And she does not, to me, represent that kind of people power, like grassroots movement, whatever. And a big part of it is like where she's been for the last 4 years. She does only sort of show up during election season, and I think the power that people are talking about when they're talking about something that can disrupt the two-party system, that can disrupt the American empire, needs to be rooted. I constantly think of the fucking Sudan resistance committees, and I think that's one of the most powerful and still neglected processes and forms of organizing from below that seriously posed a threat to the state, to the status quo, that was like rooted in local communities across this massive country of like 18 different states. I've been thinking a lot about it, obviously, because in this conference there were a lot of people from Sudan, a lot of like revolutionaries in exile, and especially now with the war situation. So anyway, sorry, I know that was like a lot of things thrown out all at once, but yeah, there's a need for radical new forms of organizing from below that I don't see within this third party thing, and the Green Party in general. I mean, structurally, like forget about Jill Stein as a personality. Um, it's not a working class movement. It's not a political party of the working class. It's not socialist. It's not rooted in sort of I don't know. Sorry, I know I'm throwing out a lot. I've got a lot to say, so I'm like rambling a bit. But yeah, I don't trust it. I don't trust any Green Party. Green parties across the world. I know it's different in the U.S. and Europe, but it's kind of like bourgeois environmentalists. Definitely much more so in the European Union. I mean, fuck the foreign minister of Germany, who has been vocally advocating for the destruction of civilian population, who has created justification for the entire destruction of Gaza, of Lebanon, under the pretext that the entire country, the entire Gaza Strip, is used as a human shield, all the infrastructure. And she's a member of the Green Party. She's also a granddaughter of a full-on Nazi, not like a conscript who was just like in his field when the Germans came and they were like, come with us, like full-on Nazi, dedicated, committed party member and the like. Anyway, so that's that. The last fun headline that I want to talk about before I start talking about the people's want is the floodings that have been happening in Catalonia and in Mecca. Huge floodings. This is the climate crisis. It's here. It's not as bad as it's going to get, but these are the sort of early signs. And it's horrible. I think in Catalonia, which is in southeastern Spain, I think it's about 70 people have been killed by these floodings. There's footage of just cars kind of like jam-packed, pulled together by the flooding, by the waters. And it's terrifying. And again, that is something that also needs radical change. Like degrowth as a concept is something that breaks the mind of most people who are liberals, who kind of just accept the status quo. This is how it is. Because once you get into essentially like the roots of capitalism, growth is one of the fundamental things. And growth necessitates a kind of infinite process, but we only have finite means. And one of the resources that exist in this world is clean air, let's say, or rather like non-polluted air. And to be doing these productions, you constantly have to, the process of industrialization, the process of shipping, and even militaries. I mean, of course, militaries require so much output of emissions. And actually, I shouldn't have brought that up because that's a very dark or like deep thing, but we need to be cutting these back. And all the proposals of shifting to green energy, it's bullshit. It's completely bullshit. the best example of all of this is the fact that the main climate meetings, COP, COP, I think the last one was in Abu Dhabi. The next one is going to be in Azerbaijan, which is literally just a petro dictatorship, which is also complicit in genocide. It has done genocide only like a year ago. The ethnic cleansing of, Naboro Karabakh, Nagorno, Artsakh. So, yeah, I don't know. I'm sorry. I know I'm rambling, and this is a lot of just sort of issue soup. I heard that term. I really hate it. But it's just another one of those things that I've seen that are kind of connected to all this, that it's the most pressing thing facing us: genocide and the climate collapse. And I came back to Vienna a couple of days ago, and there's just nothing. I was in Marseille the last 2 weeks, and the amount of tourists, again, only white, mostly white people, is just another fucking holiday. There is this insane feeling of witnessing the world collapse, of my own home collapsing, and then I took a train. I don't know. I do this thing. I went from Marseille, Geneva, Zurich, and then Zurich, Vienna. And that first train, or the second train between Geneva and Zurich was a bit delayed. And so I got on the platform for the train from Zurich to Vienna, and the train was just leaving. And for me, it's like, fuck. I missed it. Shit. It's gonna delay me. It's all fucked. There was this white woman next to me who got so flustered. Incroyable! And she looked at me with this face of anguish. And it was all I could do from not laughing. And I walked away. Like, I have no ability to empathize with white people who have this sort of disruptions. Oh, I'm so sorry your train was delayed. I'm so sorry you missed this train. Like, I'm trying not to be bitter. I am very bitter. But in my daily life, I am not very bitter. But in that moment, I was not able at all to empathize. I'm in the same situation. I don't know where she's going. I'm going literally to the farthest stop possible. But white people complaining, I have absolutely zero space for. Also zero space for them, like, enjoying their holidays and just living their life or whatever. Again, because part of it, not just that they're not doing anything to stop whatever, or that they're sort of enjoying their life in this kind of delusional state while our homes, our worlds are collapsing. But also, I know why there are so many white people, why there are so many tourists in Marseille. 50 years ago, this was not possible. That traveling like this, that holiday making to, far away places, like let's say from London to Marseille, that's quite far. Obviously now things have shifted. I'll get to that in a second. But that used to be something that was like for the bourgeoisie. Southern France, especially places like Nice or Cannes, were like literally places for the European bourgeoisie to go vacation. Like within the boundaries of Europe, but Mediterranean, and so like quite hot and whatever. And you see that. But now, especially the last, like, let's say 20 years, air travel has become incredibly cheap. You can literally get a ticket from like Vienna to Brussels or to Marseille or to London for like 20 euros. It honestly pisses me off. Like, it's not just surprising at this point, it's just that's so fucked up. Part of it, there are a lot of hidden costs in two different ways. One is that it takes a long time. Okay, it's 20 euros. Do you want this? Do you want this? Do you want this? Do you want food? Do you want baggage? Do you want whatever? And then there's a lot of like bullshit, like if you don't check in 2 hours before, they charge you 50 euros, But then there's another hidden cost, which is the cost that's pushed on to the entire world, to the future generations, to the global south. which is if you factor in how much destruction, how much in a material cost sense, these emissions will cause. These are not €20 tickets. These are like €1,000 tickets. These are millions of dollars worth of tickets. But the cost is pushed away. So it's fucked. And so it's disgusting. And that's something that I'm constantly living with here in Vienna, living literally next to a tourist attraction, going to Marseille, which I didn't know was such a big tourist attraction. But being there, it was just, I heard so much Italian and Spanish and English and German and, and again, mostly white people, because where are these $20 tickets? They're mostly in Europe. They're like 80-90%. Ryanair, Vueling or whatever it's called, EasyJet. And so there's a kind of like within Europe. And also there's this whole thing that I have that Europeans have essentially built their entire identity, way of life around holidays. Like Europe as an entity, it seems like has two things. It's keeping people out from coming in and staying, and allowing people within to go wherever the fuck and essentially live that bourgeois. The entirety of Europe has become one big petit bourgeoisie, specifically of white Europeans. Aspirational to the bourgeoisie and ability to like travel and see stuff, but there's no antagonism, there's no struggle, there's no I'm generalizing here, but I'm deeply fucking frustrated, so bear with me. Yeah, so that's been something that I've been thinking a lot about. That said, I am now going to shift towards talking about the people's want. The reason I was in Marseille, the reason I haven't released an episode in like about 2 weeks, and yeah, what I've been doing for the last period. Alright, so I was in Marseille for the last 2 weeks to attend a conference entitled The People's Want. It's the 5th edition of this conference. I attended the 4th edition back in 2022 in Montreuil. And I'll start by describing what the People's Want is before talking about my experience participating in it. I will also be leaving in the show notes a link to their Instagram and their new website, which includes their manifesto, which they've only just printed and released, entitled Revolutions of Our Times. It's free as a PDF on the website. I've read half of it. It's fucking fantastic. It's so much of what I talk about in this podcast, but expanded, because this isn't just one person. This is a network from so many different locales that's really dedicated to covering not just the revolutions, but the kind of connections between and within those revolutions. It's honestly fantastic. It's exactly something that I talk about that we need more of. And so I was just so grateful and honored to be a part of it and to continuously be a part of it. Part of me doing this episode is not just because obviously I have a lot that I want to share, but I want to push more people towards it, familiarize people with it, and it's incredible because it's something that, it's not, these are not professional internationalists. These are just people who made this thing. These are people like me, like you. There's a kind of beautiful thing about talking to certain people who are doing things and being like, oh, I could do that. I mean, that's the whole birth of this podcast. Watching and listening to people and then being like, wait, can I do that? Oh, I can do that. Anybody can do this. Podcasts are ridiculously easy. Do not buy into any feelings of authority, that a person is an expert because they have a microphone and a camera and they can say full sentences. So, The People's Want was founded, I believe, in 2019 or 18 by Syrian revolutionaries in exile in Paris. It was part of what is known as the Syrian Canteen, which is, again, a group of Syrian, I think predominantly women in exile, who opened up a community kitchen, serving Syrian food, disseminating knowledge about their revolution, and yeah, amazing food, amazing people. Now it's autonomous. The People's Want, since the last edition, is a separate thing that is connected to the Syrian canteen. There's overlap, but it is its own thing. And so, over the last 6 years, they have been organizing these conferences wherein they invite activists and revolutionaries from places like Santiago in Chile, to Colombo in Sri Lanka, to Myanmar, and obviously so many places in the Arab region, and bring them together and discuss, share their experiences and their contexts, but also very materially work towards creating connections. And I mean, the first part of it is literally just getting to know each other, because I don't really know that much about what's happening in Myanmar. The more I learn about it, the more I'm like, A, that's quite familiar, and B, those activists are quite similar to us in terms of their aspirations, and we obviously still live in the kind of human world, and so the tactics of counter-revolution and the tactics of revolution, it's limited, you know what I mean? It's not like in Myanmar they're using this sort of technology that doesn't exist in Lebanon. And so it's deeply fascinating just to sort of, I've been describing it as that feeling that, you know, when you're at a party and you're stuck in a really shitty conversation with some like drunk French white guy who's trying to explain to you, I don't know, the theories of Baudrillard or whatever. And you're, yeah. Oh, okay, interesting. But then you can overhear, kind of a few meters that way, this like group of really cool looking people talking about something like real, and you're like, fuck, I want to be in that conversation. So it's kind of like being in a space where it's all that conversation. Every single individual you talk to, every time you find yourself in a workshop, in a meeting, in a side conversation, just really interesting, dedicated, like grounded people. And so it was quite overwhelming, and you just don't have time to be in all the conversations you want to be in. And it's great. So this year the conference was held in Marseille. It was meant to be held in Lebanon, but reasons. I mean, they talked about it 2 years ago, and even 2 years ago I was like, probably not, because shit's just inevitably gonna hit the fan. Which it did. And so they held it in Marseille, which was a bit of a compromise, because obviously they don't want to keep having it, you know, within the Schengen zone, within the global north. Visa reasons, of course, but also because a big part of its concept is internationalism from below, is connecting struggles from the global south. But Marseille is a fucking amazing, incredible city. I've always heard of it as northern Algeria, and it really lived up to that like description, to that reputation. Not only because like almost every single person I talked to was Algerian. Every time I go into a store, I would ask them to parler arabe. That's like the extent of my French, and they would say oui or "we." I don't know how the French they say "we" in a weird way or whatever. And then I would try to talk to them in Arabic and just like constantly remind myself that like Algerian dialect is so different, and they're all used to talking to each other. So they when they talk Arabic, it's not like they have to talk to Syrians or whatever. Anyway, but the kind of chaos, the constant negotiation of the public space, again coming from Vienna where everything is so bureaucratized, and there's such a shape that you inevitably have to fit into, that the bus stops, opens its doors, closes its doors, and leaves. Nobody is going to get in the way of that. In Marseille, quite literally, I had people, like, as the bus is moving, knock on the door and be like, actually, no, I want to get out. And the bus stops. Opens the door and the woman gets out. Like, it's not a bus stop. It's like the side of the road. Or the opposite, people chasing down buses and be like, no, 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 let me in. And they'd get in. This is a minor, tiny example. But all, like, the main thing that I've been describing it is negotiation of the public space. The way people interact with each other. The way people interacted with me. The amount of people that just said hello. The amount of people that just opened up random conversations with me. Again, for those that know this podcast and know how much I talk about Beirut and talk about just that aspect of things, miss it so much. And it's just such a lively space. And such an interesting kind of claimed city. Honestly, I kind of fell in love. And obviously the weather, it was much hotter and sunnier. And by the Mediterranean, my fucking beloved Mediterranean. But also the flowers and the plants, very familiar. I hadn't seen a bougainvillea like that since Beirut. And I fucking love bougainvilleas. I don't know if I'm saying them right, but those like beautiful flowers that kind of like Anyway, so the conference is divided up into two sections, the off festival and then the in. Now, the reason, if you're looking at the video, why this is so different is the off festival is 5 days and the in is 2. The off was for those invited, and it was mostly workshops and lectures between ourselves and discussions, ranging from like discussions of colonial violence and how our different movements are resisting colonial violence, to like how the fuck do we build like international, like actual tangible internationalist bonds to support each other. Like sometimes just money or fundraising or materials or resources or platforms. Or I love the suggestion someone had of, we're maybe like 100 people or whatever, and like collectively tanking certain businesses, like review bombing, and especially like Zionist or literally Israeli stores or whatever. I don't know if I'm allowed to be saying stuff like this, but regardless. So yeah, those conversations are really broad and then small and then whatever. And it's just fascinating being there. The conference was in 4 languages, which to me is like, just on the surface of it, the aesthetics, let's say, it's incredible because it's constantly moving away from any centered thing. We're only talking English. And so it's like English, Arabic, French, and Spanish. And actually, when you think of it, not just as like Spanish, Spain, France, French, like all of Latin America, then like half of South America, with Spanish, and then French, you have places in the Caribbean and North Africa and like Sub-Saharan Africa, and also communities in France and a lot of exilees in France. Arabic, obviously, the Arab region. English, I think, is the most spoken language in the world, at least as like a secondary language, like a language of communication. And so you connect with quite a few people. And the effort to do that constant translation, to me, is just like so fucking powerful. You had a bunch of translators constantly, like very low tech, very, again, all volunteer. It was incredible. And it was the same as 2 years ago. And so, I don't know, like hearing from comrades, from revolutionaries in Mexico or in Chile, and they only speak Spanish. But then having access to that by this sort of translation, and then asking them a question directly. One of my favorite experiences from 2 years ago, because we also, like, as participants, declare, I speak this language and that language, so if you ever need translation, you can come to me. So I remember 2 years ago, this person from, this like feminist activist from Iraq, kind of pulled me aside. She's like, Ayman, you speak English, right? And I was like, yeah, of course. And so she's like, come. And so it was her in conversation with this French comrade who was active in like the squatting movements, and they were in conversation about squatting, you know. And so this woman asked me to translate from Arabic to English, and it was like an in-depth conversation about squatting rights, about how they do it, about the legality of it all, but also should we be working within the legal system or just constantly like in spite of it. And I was translating from Arabic to English, from English to Arabic, and it was just fascinating, connecting those conversations and like helping facilitate those relations. And so yeah, there's so many incredible conversations and discussions, and hopefully there's more building, like within the network. This is something that's hard because what happened last time is that we're all really excited and the discussions and it was so nourishing, and then the conference ends almost too soon because again, to get all these people in one place for like a week is really difficult, costs a lot, but just even logistically. So we're limited by time. But then we all go back to our own contexts and our own struggles and our own places, and we get caught up in all that. And so hopefully I feel like with this time there is going to be more of an effort to, or like more of a commitment there's to continue those conversations, continue those internationalist like building of solidarities, again, very tangibly. And so I found myself, in these incredible discussions, participating in them. I also like, it's this really funny thing where I am a very cool person in this space, which is not very usual for me. Mostly I'm quite obscure to people. Again, this is why I don't leave the house much anymore, but usually when I talk to people, it's like, oh, you do that? That sounds cool. Okay. Why are you still talking about Zionism kind of thing? Or why, or like, I don't know, when I say about the work I do or the writing I do, it's just mostly, oh, okay, interesting. Well, or then I get weird questions because they're so what. But in this space, I'm like the cool, like I'm one of the, we're all popular, we're all cool people. But it is that weird space where I'm in and I'm like, oh, I'm actually doing pretty cool stuff, or people actually value what I'm saying. It's kind of like imagining all the people listening to this podcast that like it. Sorry, that sounds really weird. Actually, that did happen at one time. I was talking and someone interrupted me, and it was like, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. Do you have a podcast? And I was like, yes. He was like, your voice is familiar. But anyway, and then like stepping outside during a smoke break. And so like, this is what a day would be like. I was there with a comrade who I will probably interview for this, who we're going to be working on a podcast together called the Mutual Aid Podcast. I don't know if I've announced it on this show, but there it is. So wake up at like 9 a.m. or like 8 a.m. Coffee, interesting discussion because it's the first time that I've seen them in person. We've talked a lot online. So just like instantly get into like really cool conversation. Until we get to the bus. Continue conversation. Random cute encounter with some Marseillan person because they're delightful. We get to the venue. People are smoking outside. Different conversation. Different cool people. Talking. Get inside. Listen. Participate. Listen. Lunch break. Interesting conversation. Smoke break. Like intentionally delay the smoke break. Like because, I don't know, we're just really loving being with each other. Discussion, workshop. And then like bus ride back to the place, conversation, get back to the apartment, rest for like a minute, and then go out at night. And again, now drunken, interesting conversations. And one of my favorite experiences is in one of these like nights out is we're sitting talking and I could hear inside, again, we're like sprawled out onto the streets, again, as I was describing, negotiation of the space, like literally just like flooded the street outside of this like small bar, and like cars would come, but it wasn't this like, why are you? It's just, there's a kind of, yeah, people are out. Sorry, I'm trying to get through. But yeah, I could hear inside that people started chanting, Shab, يريد إسقاط نظام الشعب يريد. And so I get up and I rush towards them. And yeah, there's like a group that then started like bringing in chants from their areas and their struggles. Sorry, I'm just noticing the frame rates look weird on this camera. Anyway, and so then like Sudanese comrades started chanting some chants from the Sudanese revolution that I'd seen only on TV, like on videos. And so seeing it live was just, yes, and then also me sharing some of ours from Lebanon, and especially some of the ones that are a bit more sweary, but also the ones that are a bit more fluid. I think like something like killon yani killon, all of them means all of them, has a fluidity and an ability to be integrated within a kind of internationalism, كلٌ يعني كلٌ حماتي واحد منهم Macron واحد منهم. But I also did this like Hela ho Netanyahu kiss immo, and so it was great, kind of just like arm in arm with a Sudanese comrade on my side and an Iraqi comrade on my other, kind of like using this Lebanese chant to swear at Netanyahu, this genocidal fucking maniac. But yeah, you get that brief moment of Arab joy, of leftist joy, of exilee joy. And yeah, I don't know, it's precious and it's very rare. To be holding grief very like physically between and within ourselves. Like obviously all of them know what's happening in Lebanon, but then also I know what's happening in Sudan. And having that space together of just that sort of like mutual grieving for each other's things and for our own things. Even though I did have a fantastic time, and it was just incredible. My first experience there was just life-changing, and this was like, I'm a bit more used to it, I guess, because it's my second time, but it's still incredible. I obviously was quite heartbroken constantly, on and off crying, kind of like micro-grieving, if you will, because everything is still happening in Lebanon. And I see these conversations and these connections as kind of like nuggets, as small pieces of hope, but very aware that like we need so much right now. And a lot of these things can't be forced. But just witnessing the destruction of my home, it was just constantly there, And I'm talking about it. It's not a space where I'm socializing and we're talking about this and that. But it just constantly, it's just not in the back of my mind, on the fore of my mind, but like, so I don't know, I was crying. There were a lot of times where I had to just like step out and be by myself, or pull someone aside, or like ask someone for a hug. There were also like Lebanese comrades there, one of whom comes from a village in the south, right by the border, whose entire village was just completely destroyed. They had a farm, and it was all razed. And I kind of broke a bit when someone had asked him, what about the dogs? And he kind of just went really quiet. But yeah, so there was definitely a space that held, there was space for that grief. There was space for that conversation, or those conversations, but it was really hard, and it is still hard, but it was sort of like good. It's very hard these days to have any feelings of like a silver lining, but it's that weird combination of within the grief, within the shit. Because again, a lot of the people, not just at the moment being, their homes are now being destroyed and their worlds are being destroyed, but their worlds already have been destroyed. We're talking, that this organization, the People's Want, was originally founded by Syrians in exile, whose world has already been destroyed, and for whom a lot of the people are like talking about Palestine, talking about genocide, weren't just ignoring what was happening, but were cheering it on. And so, again, there's also this thing that it's fascinating being in a leftist space that's so, like, not campist. That the norm is nobody's a fucking tanky. That I'm gonna have a conversation with someone and I'm not gonna have to worry about, getting into that awkward, well, no, it's not complicated, or that geopolitics or whatever, because most of them have experienced it themselves. Experienced that bullshit of being white-splained, white leftist-splained, if I can coin a new term, their own struggle. And so, yeah, there's like a real emphasis on that curation of the bringing together of really dedicated comrades that they themselves want to build and can have the capacity to build those internationalist bonds, which obviously tankies and campism makes very difficult. Campists do not want to build internationalist bonds. They see that as, I don't know, part of a CIA plot to weaken the proletariat. I don't know. Or it's not rooted in a geopolitical analysis. I don't know. It's bullshit. But the point is that these sort of like right-wing leftists, authoritarian leftists, have no interest in building internationalism. I think it's ridiculous. But so that's why this space is so flooded with people who are like, oh yeah, this is something that we all need. This is something that we've always needed. This is something that used to exist more of, and we need to build more of that kind of internationalism from below to counter the internationalism from above. Globalization, the American, the war on terror, Zionism. It's like important to note that internationalism is very well and alive, but it's an internationalism of states. It's an internationalism of nations, of global capitalism. And to counter that, we need an internationalism from below. I think that's something that's very heavily mentioned within this manifesto, which again, I heavily recommend. And yeah, honestly, I don't know how to describe the rest of this. It was just that kind of intellectual experience, the social experience, the emotional experience. It's great. It's nourishing. I use that word a lot because it just fills me up at a time when I'm so depleted. To be seeing all these people that are doing incredible work, set against a patriarchal backlash and capitalist and climate collapse. From Palestine, from Argentina, from Mali, from Taiwan and India. And again, it kind of opens my mind a bit because I think Arabs or whatever, we do have this tendency to think of ourselves and then Europe, and the West, that there's us in the West. And that's it. And we forget that the West is not a monolith, that there are a lot of people within the global North who are not, let's say, of the global North, but also that there's a whole world out there. And they're not represented by the states that rule over them. And that there's a lot of really cool shit happening, that people are pushing back, that people are constantly finding new ways of organizing. And again, it's not just people going out and protesting, it's people building autonomous areas wherein there's no police from the state, that they're kind of literally huge hectares of land that they live off of, and that they protect themselves, and they're building their own microeconomies and shit. Or this like new city that was built off of Delhi with the workers' movement, with the farmers' movement rather, that had these community kitchens that fed hundreds of thousands of people a day, or 100,000 people a day. Their own like community libraries and community whatever. So yeah, again, when I was there 2 years ago, the resistance committees in Sudan had only been just releasing these revolutionary charters. And again, nobody was fucking talking about it. In that space, everyone was just like, oh, this is new. I had known about it because I was doing research and I've been following things in Sudan because the revolution was quite like simultaneous with ours in many ways. But yeah, there's so much that we can learn from each other, so much that we can share, that is widely neglected. And it's really important to hold space for the fact that it's not this dichotomy of we in the global south have things to share to the global north and they're just not listening, they're liberals and bullshit and whatever, but that there's stuff we can talk about ourselves. There's stuff we can be sharing between ourselves, like south to south, let's say. And that this is definitely a space for that. Um, and so I'm so honored to have participated in it as an invited guest. I was also on a panel about the instrumentalization of queer struggles. Obviously, I have a lot to say about that I have already talked about quite a bit on this podcast. But yeah, it's a fascinating organization. And yeah, I'm going to be continuing this with guest interviews over the next few episodes, I guess, to bring in other reflections from other struggles, like people who have organized and come into the People's Want. Again, partly I want to have those conversations because I really loved meeting those people and I want to have a space to continue those conversations. B, I do want to continue some of the bigger conversations that are happening within the People's Want. And C, these people are coming from different contexts, from different struggles. And so I think it's just very interesting to hear how they experienced, as individuals, but as people coming from those contexts, experience this and think about internationalism and think about the People's Want and what they're trying to do. And yeah, because obviously I have my own baggage coming from Lebanon, having, yeah, and other stuff, living in Vienna. So yeah, I think that's going to occupy a few episodes in the near future, so keep an eye out for that. And I think that's about it. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. This has been another episode of Politically Depressed. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider supporting it by donating either monthly on patreon.com/fromtheperiphery or with a one-time donation in the tip jar below. If you can't support financially, you can still help this podcast grow by liking and subscribing if you're listening to this on YouTube, or leaving a review and or a rating if you're listening to this on any of the podcast apps. It helps boost this whole thing in the algorithm, reaching more people, and yeah. So, I think that's it for me. I'll see you all next time.